Games folder. App switcher. Close. Activate. Default. Showdown. Showdown. Home. Showdown. Show stats. Button. Chapter 1. Making bail. The cell door closes with a clank that sounds like a verdict. The young deputy twirls the keys mockingly as he strolls back to the single desk in the Willow Creek jail. So, a voice says behind you, "What are you in for?" A man in the adjoining cell, reclined comfortably on what passes for a bed, looks at you from beneath the brim of his cowboy hat. He wears dungarees and a cotton shirt, but his soft leather vest and long braids mark him as one of youths currently making camp near town. Ignore him. No good comes from talking to criminals. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 4. Give him the stink eye. Radio button. Ask him for his story. Give him the stink eye. Ask him for his story. He looks like a kindred spirit. Next. Button. The irony of the thought is not lost on you. Of course, that must mean you are innocent. Of course I'm innocent. It's all a misunderstanding. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 3. Technically no. But there's a good reason. Radio. I'm. Next. Button. Of course you are. So, why are you here? I was on a case. Radio button. Checked. I was interviewing Jesse, the kid, for my next. I was playing in a high-stakes card game. Radio button. I was having a quiet drink. Radio button. Unchecked. I was in a showdown. Radio button. Unchecked. Next. Button. Life as a freelance detective has its ups and downs, sometimes when you least expect them. You knew when you took a case for the mayor's wife that it wasn't going to end well, but the money was good, and you hadn't had an assignment from the Green Gage agency, for whom you frequently work, in long enough that your cupboard was down to beans. Of course, when the mayor of Willow Creek, Alan Gray, caught you following him to the lamplight, Willow Creek's brothel, just as his wife suspected, he was quick to see that Sheriff Josiah Rogers was summoned to keep you out of his business. How did you try to avoid arrest? Put on my winning smile and tried to talk my way out. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 3. Threatened to draw. Rogers knows I'm quicker than he is. Radio button. Put down some money with Rogers on the outcome of the news on Gray's. Next. Button. You've always been known as a charmer, but with Gray staring Rogers down in the middle of the street, and the soiled doves of the lamplight watching from their windows, the sheriff was left with little choice but to arrest you for interfering and generally making a nuisance. You could tell he felt bad about it though. Next. Button. Next. Button. Willow Creek, Colorado Territory has been your home for a while now, long enough to get to know the locals and the local politics, at any rate. It's the fall of 1872, and the war between the states is a thing of the past, though some folks still seem to live it. The territory. What did you do during the war? I fought in the war, just like any man should have. Radio. I disguised myself as a man to fight in the war. Radio button. I am a man of diplomacy, not combat. Radio button. Unchecked. 3 of 4. I am a woman of diplomacy. Next. Button. What did you do during the war? Next. Button. Despite the war going on, work continued on the railroad, which was completed in 1869. It's considered one of the greatest feats of American technology of the century, and maybe ever. It also put you through plenty of hard labor, which has given you confidence in your physical skills. It has been difficult to gain acceptance among the dominantly white population, but in your years at Willow Creek, you've shown yourself to be competent enough at your work that most folks are willing to ignore your background these days. What is your name? Han Tao. Radio button. Bai Li. Radio button. Lu Jen. Radio button. I don't like any of these names. Radio button. Next. Button. What is your family name? Show stats. But what is text field? Double tap to edit. Use the rotor to access. Next. Button. Text field. Double tap. Text field is editing. Insertion point at end. Cap F. Foxtrot. Cap V. Vic. Cap B. Bravo. Cap B. C X Z Sh L K J H J K L. Live L K J H G F D S A P O. Space. Dict. Emote. Number. Delete. L. Cap B. Inserted grace. Dictate. Cap G R A Y S O N. Nova. OK. Prediction. Yes. OK. Done. Button. Next. Previous. Dimmed. Net. Text field is edit. Next. Button. Your given name? Text field. Double tap. Insertion point at end. Next. Button. First thing in the morning, someone comes by to pay your bail. It is something of a surprise when you see Amelia Greengage, head of the Denver City office of the Green Gage Detective Agency, signing for your release. You've done work as a consultant for the Green Gage Agency from time to time, but if anyone were going to pay your bail, you'd have expected it to be your sweetheart. Like with many of the other rules of the West, ideas about romance are a little more flexible out here than they are back east. Who are you seeing these days, anyway? Elijah Hammond, an inveterate gambler. Radio button. John Gordon, a cowboy. Radio. Summer Rain, a soiled dove. Radio button. Actually, I have an unrequited love for Miss Greengage. Radio button. Unchecked. Who needs a sweetheart? I've got my gun and my horse. Radio button. Unchecked. Next. Button. Who needs a sweetheart? Next. Button. Who? Actually, I have an unrequited love for. Who? Next. Button. Unrepentant sinner, she scolds, but you can tell from her smile that it doesn't bother her one bit to be bailing you out. I'll have you know I'll be docking your bail money from your payment. Assuming, of course, that you're interested in a job. Of course. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 3. If I have to. I'll have to check. If I have to. I guess I'm in her debt. Radio button. I'll have to check my calendar. Radio button. Next. Button. Your enthusiasm is greatly appreciated, she says, and despite her dry tone, you'd think she means it. Amelia describes the case. Victoria Fry, the 16-year-old daughter of local rancher Julian Fry, went missing 3 days ago. Sheriff Rogers is working on the case, but Fry's very concerned about his daughter's well-being, and he's hired the agency to consult on the case. You'll be working with Deputy Todd Winslow, Amelia explains. Someone has to keep an eye on you, or you're bound to set my town alight, Rogers calls from his desk. That only happened the once, you protest, joking. Shut it, Grayson, before I forget myself and keep you locked in there, Rogers shouts back, laughing. Next, button. The first thing to do seems to be heading on out to the Fry Ranch to investigate. Amelia turns you over to Deputy Winslow, informing you that she'll be staying at the Riverside Hotel working on a different project should you need to discuss the case. Todd Winslow is a reedy man with a cruel smile who likes his fists a bit more than a lawman should, in your opinion. You've never gotten along with him, but you'll make the best of it for the case. Based on his condescending expression, you're not sure he'll do the same for you. Out to Fry's then? He asks, though you know he doesn't actually mean for you to have a say in this first move. Lead on, you answer, and as soon as you're both mounted up, you make your way out to the Fry Ranch. Chapter 2, meanwhile, back at the ranch, there's some folks who would call the Fry Ranch idyllic. With acres of grazing land, interrupted by the occasional cottonwood, leading right into the foothills of the Rockies, it's a prime location for cattle. That Willow Creek, the town's namesake river, flows right through the property means there's good fishing to be had as well. Fry settled here, but there's still a wild to the land that I love. Radio button, checked, 1 of 3. A man, seems to me there, next, button. If the fences weren't so obvious, and the ranch buildings not so clearly rising in front of you, you could imagine this as still open territory and wilderness. You allow yourself a moment to appreciate the scenery before Winslow interrupts your thoughts. Well, Grayson, can't say I'm much pleased about this arrangement, the deputy drawls. I'm sure you're a fine investigator. You can tell by the way he leaves the sentence hanging that he's dubious about your abilities. I don't take offense. This is a job. I do the job, and then I get paid. Radio button, checked, 1 of 3. And I'm sure you're a fine deputy. I say, echoing his disparaging tone exactly. I tell him I'm not looking for a fight. I just want to make sure the missing girl gets found. Radio button, unchecked. Check, next, button. Winslow looks skeptical of your motives, and you sense that he isn't personally invested in the case, despite the fact that real people are involved. So I trust you'll leave the heavy investigating to the professional then? He says, I am playing second fiddle. I make it clear that he and I are in this as equals. Radio button, checked, 1 of 4. I agree, next, button. I wait to see if Winslow greets him, radio button, checked, do you greet him? Before you can approach the Fry house, you have to pass several outbuildings, including more than a few barns for housing animals and machinery in the residences of the ranch hands. Outside the bungalow where most of the cowboys live, you see a few hands lounging, John Gordon among them. One of the few black cowboys working on the ranch, he's easy to recognize at a distance. Do you greet him? I wait to see if Winslow greets him, radio button, checked, 1 of... I steer my horse in his direction for a chat. I dismount so we can talk on the same level. I ignore the cowboy, radio button, next, button. Winslow completely ignores the cowboy's approach, urging his horse along at a slightly faster pace. You suppose that on official business, it's regulation behavior to talk to the head of the house before his hands. Or it could be that Winslow's even more misanthropic about cowboys, or blacks, than he is about everyone else. Follow his lead, radio button, checked, 1 of 3. How, I was planning to, next, button. If Winslow's set on talking to Fry first, you'll go along with it. It's not much farther to the ranch house. Winslow gets there just enough ahead of you that he's already hitched his horse to the post and made it to the door before your horse is settled. As you join him, Fry's housekeeper and cook, Mrs. Ford, is opening the door. Deputy Winslow, she says with what you suspect is forced cheerfulness. We had no idea Sheriff Rogers was sending you out today. Winslow smiles. Hope it's a pleasant surprise, he says, with every expectation that it should be. We're all very concerned about Victoria, he continues, without an ounce of empathy in his voice. I'm just glad it's not another of Mr. Mason's messengers from the bank, Mrs. Ford says crossly. I've had about enough of Mr. Mason's pressure on poor Mr. Fry. But today Mr. Fry is out at the north fence, repairing a break, she explains. Which is what I was trying to tell you, John Gordon says, arriving behind you on foot. Mr. Fry hoped someone might be along today. I'll take y'all to him. Winslow looks annoyed. He clearly expected Fry to be waiting for his arrival, wringing his hands in worry for his daughter. How would you like to investigate? I'd like to look for clues in the ranch house, radio button. The ranch hands are sure to know some. I'd like to look for clues. The ranch hands are sure to know. I asked Mrs. Ford for some coffee and we should talk to Fry. Next, button. We should talk to Fry and I'm curious about that broken fence. Next, button. John Gordon accompanies you back to the bunkhouse, where a handful of the ranch hands are gathered. One of them has a broken leg, and the other, pennies? Let's increase the stakes with nickels and loosen their tongues. Radio button, checked, 1 of 3. Throw down a few pennies of my own to buy into their game. Radio button. Ignore the game and ask for a few minutes of their time. Radio button, unchecked. Next, ignore, next, button. You ain't interested in playing, we ain't interested in talking, says broken leg. He turns his back on you in a direct snub. Oh, that does it. I tell him to draw. Radio button, checked, 1 of, I won't take that insult. I'll beat information out of him. Radio button. Alright, I'll join the game. Radio button. I won't take that insult. I'll beat information out of him. Radio button, unchecked. I'm clearly not going to get anything useful out of them anyway. Back to the investigation. Radio button, unchecked, 4. Next, button. How would you like to investigate? I'd like to look for clues in the ranch house. Radio button, checked, 1 of 5. We should talk to I'm finished investigate. Next, button. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ford, allows you to look around the inside of the house, mostly because Deputy Winslow flashes his badge and she doesn't quite have the gumption to argue with him. Mrs. Ford leads you to Victoria's room, which is casually messy but without the broken objects you'd associate with a struggle. We haven't moved anything much since she disappeared, Mrs. Ford says. Next button. But it's the less common items that strike your interest. Under her, you also detect a scent of gunpowder in the room, and a careful examination of one pair of gloves shows powder burn on the fingers. In a jewelry box on her vanity, you find among some baubles a shell casing. It seems Victoria may not be the innocent, play-by-the-rules young woman her father makes her out to be. Look for more clues outside her window. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 3. Look. Next button. Next. How would you like to investigate? I asked John Gordon for his opinion. Radio button. I asked Mrs. Ford for some coffee and we should talk to Fry and I'm curious about that broken fence. Radio button. I'm finished investigating. Next button. Grace and Roger, you reply. Fry looks you over, then nods to the deputy. Cattle stampeded and busted right through, Fry says grumpily, pointing to the beginning of the broken section. Had to move 'em all out to the south pastures this week till we could get it fixed. He offers you his hand. Julian Fry. Grace and Roger, he's aiding in the investigation, Winslow interrupts. You plan to arrest Gilbert Mason yet? Fry asks Winslow, almost casually, but you can see the worry. Winslow grumbles something about not having enough evidence, giving you a chance to ask Fry some questions. Did you know anything about your daughter learning to? Can you tell us more about why you suspect Mason? Radio button. Did something cause the cow? Can you tell us more about why you? Next button. I like that you cut right to the heart of the issue, Fry says. Mason and me, we go back a long time. Competed on pretty much everything. Mostly in good fun, no hard feelings on either side. You're a little skeptical about that remark, but Fry carries on without pause. Ought to be in their reservations and off our territory by now, says Fry's ranch hand. I have no doubt that he would stoop to kidnapping to get his way, Fry says with conviction. Has he claimed to have done it? Not yet, and I intend to get her back before he can, Fry says. As though he expects you to magically make Victoria appear at a moment's notice, Fry turns back to mending his fence, and you don't get much more of use from him. How would you like to investigate? I asked John Gordon for his opinion. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 3. I asked Mrs. Ford for some coffee. I'm finished investigating. Next button. Gordon has a well-deserved reputation as a forthright and honest type, if a bit overly loyal to the Frys. Mr. Fry gave Gordon a job when he first came to Willow Creek, and the trust Fry's shown Gordon has given him a rosy picture of the family. Even so, he's likely to have some good information. Mr. Gordon, what do you think happened to Vic? Gordon takes off his hat, kneading the brim in his hands. Can't help but think it has something to do with Gilbert Mason, he says. The banker, Winslow says dryly. Troubles between those two go back a long way, or so I hear. Ask him what's troubling him. Radio button. Troubles between those two. Ask him if he knows. Ask him if. Next button. He hesitates, shooting a look at Winslow before turning back to you. Fact is, I'm a little worried over Mr. Fry, not just because of Miss Victoria. I think times are harder for the ranch than he's letting on. He let Joe Nelson go 2 weeks back, and he's been quarreling with Mrs. Ford about the expense of stocking her kitchen. He puts his hat back on before continuing. We'll take that under consideration, Winslow says. You do that, Gordon says. How would you like to investigate? I ask Mrs. Ford. Next button. Mrs. The coffee is very good. Mrs. Ford lets you and Winslow sit down at her table, and though Winslow clearly thinks this is a waste of time, he keeps what little charm he has turned on whenever Mrs. Ford looks his way. He explains that you're consulting on the case, and assures Mrs. Ford that finding Victoria is one of the sheriff's top priorities. The coffee is very good. As you drink, Mrs. Ford bustles around the kitchen, saying how glad she is that the sheriff is focusing so much attention on. How do you get information from Mrs. Ford? I compliment Mrs. Ford's coffee and guide conversation to ranch gossip. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 3. Mrs. Next button. It isn't hard to get Mrs. Ford talking about life on the ranch. It's actually much harder to get her to let go of a topic you're not particularly interested in. But you manage to steer the conversation to find out what you need to know. Next button. You also find out that the dispute between Fry and Mason goes back to when both of them were. Once talk moves on to the various ranch hands, or stories about Mrs. Ford's own poor, departed husband, you realize that the housekeeper's well of information has run dry. How would you like to investigate? Next. I'm finished investigating. Radio. Checked. Next button. Next. Go after the horsemen. The cowboys can handle the cows. Go after the horse. Help. Get the heck out of Dodge. Next. Get the heck out of Dodge. This isn't my job. Next button. You agree with Winslow. This is your chance to find out more about what's really going on at the Fry Ranch. You gallop after the horsemen, but it's clear that their head start is going to make catching them a challenge. I trust my physical control of my horse. Ride hard and we'll catch 'em. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 3. Next button. You encourage your horse to his fastest, and you're soon within close enough range to see that these men are Intoots. They're definitely white men, though you can't tell if they're from Winslow is still well behind you, so you follow the rider you think you're most likely to catch. I shoot back. Radio button. Checked. 1 of 4. Winslow is still well behind you, so you follow the rider you think you're most likely to catch. You're almost on him when you hear gunfire, and a bullet ricochets off. I trust my luck to get. Retreat. Next, retreat. I've got enough information to clear Utes. That'll have to do. Radio. Check. Next button. You wheel back to meet up with Winslow and give it. He also seems relieved that he won't have to give you credit for capture. Chapter 3, Mason's Secrets. Button. Gilbert Mason lives in the largest house inside the boundaries of Willow Creek, a 3-story brick confection with a large porch and a balcony overlooking each level, complete with a widow's walk on the upper story and a brick wall separating the lawn from the street. Civilization is about structure. Willow Creek may not be much civilization, Maybe one day, but it's got a long way to go. Radio button. Unchecked. Civilization is about structure. Next button. Gilbert Mason lives in the large. Civilization is about structure. Willow Creek is Willow Creek. Next button. We've heard folks from out east who might argue that case, but to you, as you and Winslow ride up toward the Mason mansion, Elijah Hammond, the town's best-known gambler and occasional troublemaker, is leaving, closing the gate on the brick wall behind him. As Elijah heads in your direction, Winslow cracks his knuckles, steering his horse forward with his knees. Been meaning to rough up Hammond for some time now, he says. That man has far too pretty a face for his own good. I sweet-talk Winslow into letting me have a chat with Elijah. Radio button. A little violence might not go amiss. Radio button. Talking to Elijah is a waste of our time. Radio button. Unchecked. A little violence might not go amiss. Next button. Talk. A little violence might not go amiss. Talk. Next button. I'll handle it, you tell Winslow, cracking your knuckles. The deputy's perpetually sour face lights up, and he takes your horse as you dismount. You shove Elijah up against the wall surrounding Mason's mansion, hidden from the house's view by Mason's well-kept cottonwood trees. What business do you have with Mason? You demand. Elijah doesn't put up much of a fight. He doesn't have a reputation for violence, and you can see by the sheen of sweat that breaks out on his normally hard-to-read face that the threat of it is enough to cow him. How the man has survived saloon brawls is a mystery. You let him go, and he stumbles forward briefly as Winslow approaches. Elijah leans back, his easy bluff expression back on before Winslow could notice a change. That is a fine reason for me to divulge information to the authorities. To answer Deputy Winslow's question, Mr. Mason has offered me the opportunity to invest in a business proposition. As you know, what kind of opportunity? Winslow badgers. Elijah shrugs. I only listened to the pitch, Deputy Winslow, and I admit to being intrigued enough to buy into the initial offering. But he's not divulged the full information of his project, nor did I ask. Winslow mutters, and bullshit. The deputy waves his hat at the gambler. Get on minding those grand pictures then, Hammond, and don't dawdle too long on the streets. Hammond nods. Wouldn't dream of it. Next button. How do you intend to approach Mason? Winslow, I use my investigative skills to find a surreptitious point of entry. Radio button, checked. 1 of 3. I trust my luck that the back door is open, and no one's I approach Mason directly and knock on the door. Radio button. Next button. No, thanks, button. Restore purchases. No, thanks, button. We hope you've enjoyed playing Showdown at Willow Creek. Play again. Play more games like this. Radio. Share. Email me when new games are available. Games folder. Screen recording in progress. Button.